G'day, how are ya? Today, let's talk about some lessons learned while working as a game designer on World of Warcraft. I joined WoW around 2015 and was there till I left Blizzard kind of end of 2020. I did some class work, revamped the mission and follower system for Legion. I spun up Warfronts, built the horrific visions, and a bunch of other features in between. While working on WoW, I learned some great lessons and thought it might be valuable to share them with you here today. When I started on the WoW team, my first focus was on reworking some of the classes, specifically the Shaman and the Hunter. This was also when we were doing a lot of the class ability pruning, so it was kind of a unique situation where there was already a lot of sweeping changes happening. When I joined the class team, the most common way a new ability was designed was by kind of starting with a mechanic that wasn't working and trying to fix it, or adding something that could help with the rotation. And this is a totally fine approach, especially when it's in more of a maintenance mode, but it can risk classes falling into a bit of a random toolkit result, where they have a bunch of neat tools, but thematically they aren't strong. Instead, I decided to approach it more like how I designed the Crusader on Diablo, and started way more kind of fantasy first. The benefit to starting with the fantasy is you approach the class much more holistically. It doesn't mean you discard the value of the mechanics, more that the mechanics are there to serve the fantasy as opposed to just being kind of these neat design tools. For the Shaman, I really wanted to capture the feeling of them being this kind of master of the elements, lightning, volcanic fire, you know? I wanted to get the class feeling more dynamic, less reliant on these stacking buffs, and more about flowing with the combat. Stacking buffs just felt really mechanical, so I tried to move away from it. This led to making Maelstrom really core to the rotation. I mean, it kinda already was a resource in the form of these stacking buffs. We just codified it as such and folded in other abilities into the resource itself. It became much less predictable and way more of a dynamic rotation. I know a lot of these changes have been reverted back, and I personally feel like that's a bit of a miss. It may even be largely my fault. I sort of wish I had been a bit more aggressive with the rework of the class as opposed to what I did, which still felt like more working inside the box of what I had. The Hunter is an example of a much more aggressive rework, far more aligned to the fantasy, that I think has played out kind of better than the Shaman. At the time, every spec on the Hunter basically played the same way, with only a few unique abilities distinguishing each spec. So again, leaning into the fantasy hard, I decided to get really aggressive. This is where I made survival spec purely melee and moved marksman spec into way more of an exclusive ranged role. There was even a time when marksman couldn't even summon a pet. This felt too far, and we ended up with Lone Wolf, which worked out really well. I wanted the marksman to play and feel like they were this true sniper, basically impossible to defeat if they could catch you at range, but if you got close to them, wow, you were in trouble. Survival, on the other hand, was entirely focused on melee, and they used their pet to surround and destroy enemies up close. Obviously, this was pretty contentious at the time. Such an aggressive change to classes was rarely done, and it was pretty risky. If I was approaching this from the perspective of adding or refining a mechanic or two, it never would have been possible to push the specs so far apart from each other and ultimately give players more variety with their specs. It's not that this kind of variety was unheard of either. I mean, look at the Warrior and how different their spec choices are, and how unique the playstyle is for each. This is more where I wanted the Hunter to go, and I'm glad that the core of these changes have stuck around. Fun fact, this pretty aggressive approach to redesigning the class almost inspired the designer working on the Warlock to actually give them a tank spec, but ultimately, that didn't happen. We always had to be really careful about adding too many tank specs to the game. It's kind of a shame. I think it would have been really cool if we could have pulled that off. Look, was each class perfect? Did everyone in the community love these changes? No. No, of course not. In fact, I kind of expect a bunch of people to let me know how much they disliked the changes down in the comments below. The reality is, you can't make everyone happy, and trying to do so is a false fallacy. But by having a clear fantasy to design to, it can bring the elements of that design together holistically. While working on the classes, one of the most powerful tools we had was regular feedback. It's one thing to do design, share it with some folks, implement it and test it yourself. It's a whole other ballgame, being able to get people who really understand the game playtesting your changes on a regular cadence. We always did public tests, but those are pretty heavy loads to do, and they're extremely external facing. It's hard to do experimentation when you're under public scrutiny. Fortunately, we had what was called the QA/UX team. This is a group of around, say, 10 members of QA that were extremely strong at playing, analyzing, and breaking down the changes that we were making. Most time, these were folks who played in some pretty hardcore guilds in their off hours, and each member of the team was assigned a class that they focused on. On a regular cadence, say every 2 weeks, this team would meet with the class team and discuss the changes that were being made. This was amazingly useful. As a designer, this let me ask questions and get feedback on changes we were making on a regular basis. It allowed for us to experiment a little with tuning or introduce large changes and give context on what we wanted from those changes, what we were trying to achieve. QA/UX was then able to take that context, test the change, and let us know if we were moving in the desired direction or not. The hidden benefit here is that we were training some extremely talented QA folk on how to think like designers. Whenever there were opportunities for design roles on the team, the QA department was always encouraged to apply, and of course, many did. More often than not, some of the strongest junior designers that joined the WoW team full-time came from that QA/UX team. It was a fantastic training ground / incubator for junior designers. Of all the ways I've experienced or seen of supporting junior folk to become designers, that QA/UX team, it always felt like it not only gave the best results, but it was a really positive environment too for both sides. You know, both the class designers and the QA/UX team got a lot out of it. So lesson, find creative ways to foster junior talent, even if it's not by giving them a job. Maybe it's more about providing them with regular access to the team so that they can learn. In my time in the industry, I've almost exclusively used custom game editors. The reality is when I started, engines like Unreal or Unity really didn't exist, or they were only useful for really specific types of games. From the editors to Dawn of War to Diablo, I've seen and used quite a few different tools to make games. Yet none of them compared to WoW Edit and how fast it allowed for iteration of content. To give you an idea of how the editor worked at just like a really super high level, everyone on the team had a copy of WoW Edit on their computer. This is the program that lets you make changes to data, anything from how long a spell takes to cast, to what visual effect is used for the spell, the quests, how characters spawn in the world, basically everything. Think like a copy of Unity Editor, but built from the ground up for World of Warcraft. They also had a local server running on their computer with a local client of that game that WoW Edit constantly talked to. When you made a change in WoW Edit, that change then showed up in your local server and your local game pretty much instantly. For example, let's say you wanted to make a new fireball spell. You create the spell in the editor, added the damage values, set up the visuals, you then clicked on your game client, typed a console command, and your character could cast that spell without you having to reboot the server or anything. It was just there, and if you set it up correctly, it worked. In addition to this, say you wanted to change the visual effect of the spell you just made, or maybe like the damage values. Well, you change it in the editor, then the next time you cast it in the game, you would see that change. No need to recompile, no need to even restart the client. And it wasn't just for spells. Pretty much everything in the game worked like this, from spells to quests to placing characters to whatever. If you've ever done game development, you'll probably appreciate just how powerful this is. In almost every game engine I've ever worked on, when you make a change to the data, you need to reload the game in order to play that change and test it. This can take anywhere from a few seconds, which is really rare, to a few minutes, which is more common. This means that it can be really hard to iterate on the changes that you're trying to make. Let's say you were trying to iterate on a part of the game that you're working on in a traditional engine. Say, the timing of a series of enemies that spawn in after you're ambushed. First, you set up some timing that you think will work. Then you launch the game, you move through the level until you get to the ambush, you play through it and test it. You need to note down the changes that you think you want to make to improve it. You make those changes, restart the game, go through the level again, and test it. All of this takes quite a lot of time. If each time you make a change, there's a few minutes, 10 minutes waiting between making the change and testing it, the reality is you're only going to make the change a few times before you decide, well, that's good enough, if that. In WoW Edit, however, you could trigger the wave, test it, change it, trigger it again, test it, change it again and again and again. It was really fast because you never had to exit the game and restart it. If you set up the event correctly, you could just add a button to your hotbar, then reset and trigger the wave. You could just trigger the ambush with the push of a button. This speed of iteration leads to much better end results. The designers feel like they can rapidly iterate on big and small details. This raises the whole quality bar of the game dramatically. Rather than having a good enough mentality, it was much more of a just kind of one more tweak mentality. The whole development method became one of polish. This all came down to the power of the tool. This ability to iterate resulted in some astoundingly high quality content. Do not hire, foster, or tolerate talented jerks. I'll say, I think at one point in my early career, I probably fell into this category as well. Fortunately, I had a manager who didn't tolerate it. They let me know pretty clearly what I was doing and how to overcome it, and thankfully, I was able to. Now, I'm not going to say anyone's name in particular, but there were some people on the WoW team who fit this description. There's so many reasons why this is bad. Not only does it risk creating the kinds of situations that lead to lawsuits, it also makes for a really challenging, even stifled, creative working environment. It can become an environment driven by fear. It was pretty common to expect to get pretty verbally beaten up when you took a feature into a playtest with these people. At times, this felt more like it was just for the sake of beating you up instead of providing constructive criticism about the feature, more about making themselves look good or feel clever. This was made worse by these people being in positions of authority. Worse still, seeing these people get promoted into these positions in spite of the way that they behaved. This approach is, unfortunately, pretty common across the industry. It's not just a Blizzard thing. The mentality of criticize to inspire is a fairly common trend even today. Does it result in some pretty amazing things? Sure. I mean, look at the games that Blizzard made back then. Is it the only way to accomplish that? No. There was a different kind of creative push that I experienced while working there, and it absolutely didn't come from these jerks. It came from the incredibly talented peers that I was working next to. Blizzard's reputation resulted in some of the most inspiring people all working together on these games. The people I worked next to, they were doing work that was astounding, some of the best I'd ever seen. What drove me, and I'd say most of us, wasn't the fear that these jerks leveraged, it was the desire to live up to the work being done by my peers. I knew that what they were working on was going to be incredible, so I would push myself to do something equally good. I'll also say the team was very large. I think it was over 300 people when I was on it. The number of jerks was very small, only a few. I think the overall success of the game and the team was due to the amazing leaders who were on the team, who had a very different leadership style and were able to support their teams to do incredible work. It's just really unfortunate that these jerks were tolerated. The takeaway from this one, which I wish was more common but unfortunately isn't, is foster a zero tolerance policy for talented jerks. Shoot him out of a damn cannon. Ever since Dawn of War Dark Crusade, where we wanted to do the campaign map more as this large-scale live war, I've always looked for ways to do huge-scale interactions between players to unlock content. I mean, what could be more social than a massive worldwide community working together? On WoW, my attempt at this was the towers on the Broken Shore. The intent here was to have players contribute some form of resource to the construction of the towers. Once a tower had enough resources contributed to it, the benefits of that tower would become active for a period of time. Then it would reset, and the next tower that was contributed to would become active, and so on and so on and so forth. By players, I mean all players in an entire region of the world. So everyone playing the United States or Europe or Korea, they'd all have their own towers that could be rebuilt. From a design perspective, this seems super compelling, right? Like encouraging hundreds of thousands of players to work together to accomplish a common goal. What could possibly be more social than that? Well, turns out it doesn't feel very social at all. What it ends up feeling like is you're just doing regular quests, turning in a token and not seeing any impact. The reality is the scale is so large that one player turning in a single token really doesn't have any visible impact on the progress of it all. It really just felt like the towers were moving along on their own. Interestingly, this whole thing kind of sounds similar to the live service of Helldivers 2, and I guess in some ways it is. I think the difference is that the core gameplay in Helldivers 2 itself is social. You are always playing moment-to-moment activity that is better when played with others, and there's just a passive benefit of doing that which is moving the war forward. For the towers, it didn't feel social because everything, from the act of collecting the tokens, to contributing them, to the benefits you got from them, were all done in a solo manner. Heck, even the Mage Tower boss fights, probably the best part of the benefits, it's a solo thing. None of it really leaned into the do this with friends element that would drive that social. The big takeaway here, of course, is that social is better when it's more intimate. In my mind, it's better to have systems which encourage you to find and play with a few regular players. It's impossible to develop a social relationship with 10,000 people. That's meaningless. I actually think that an MMO with a server of under 100 players would feel better than any server with thousands. There's so many more stories I have from working on World of Warcraft that I could probably go on for a lot longer, but I'm gonna save those for another video maybe and wrap it up here. I hope you found these as valuable and interesting as I did learning and sharing them. If you'd like to hear some more stories about Blizzard and design lessons, I have another video where I talk about Diablo and Last Epoch. I'll share it right here. For now though, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.